Welcome to the Spring 2020 Shipka Speakers Lectures. My name is Michael Jerrison of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and it's wonderful to see you here today. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Dr. Thomas A. and Albert J. Shipka Speakers Series, which is the second largest lecture series on campus. Dr. Tom Shipka is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, and his father, Mr. Albert J. Shipka, was a longtime union leader in Ohio and a former member of the YSU's Board of Trustees. We are very grateful to the group of alumni and community and university donors we call the Philosophy Circle for their contributions to the series and to our department. All right, now in a survey conducted by the American Academy of Religion, the National Academic Organization found that even though many colleges and universities employ religious studies faculty and host religious studies departments, most religious studies faculty, colleagues, and staff at these very colleges do not understand what religious studies scholars actually do. Due to this confusion, I want to say a little bit about the discipline itself. Religion has been influential in the ethics of medicine, the crafting of legal decisions. It has become important in understanding the role of terrorism and, if anybody has been paying attention to politics, race. Religion has been front and center in many of our candidates' remarks and subsequent controversies. In light of the importance of religion in our lives, I am grateful that we have such esteemed scholars here today, Susan Hayward and Matthew Walton. Susan Hayward is a senior advisor for religion and inclusive societies at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Hayward leads the Institute's efforts to understand religious dimensions of conflict around the world and advances efforts engaging religious actors and organizations in peace building. I mean, that's what she does full time. She has assisted countries in their foreign policy decisions. In fact, that's where I met her once. We were actually deciding and trying to advise one country on how to deal with a conflict, which she does all the time. She meets with key and integral actors in conflict areas and usually does so without any recognition. So she does it under the wire. So this is a person who does work all the time for us in the world. Prior to joining the Institute, Hayward worked with the Academy of Educational Development's office in Colombo, Sri Lanka, as a fellow of the program on negotiation at Harvard's Law School, and with the conflict resolution program at the Carter Center in Atlanta. Hayward also conducted political asylum and refugee work with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and Advocates for Human Rights. She wears many hats, as she likes to say. In addition to her policy work, she's a minister for the Church of Christ. She has been a professor teaching at Georgetown and George Washington University, and serves as a regular guest lecturer and trainer at the Foreign Institute and universities worldwide, and has been a very helpful and key supporter and worker for the Council of Foreign Relations. Her latest book is a co-edited volume with Catherine Marshall, Women, Religion, and Peace Building, that, believe it or not, has a foreword written by President Jimmy Carter. No small feat, right? Matthew Walton is a professor in comparative political theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Prior to his appointment, he was the first ever inaugural Aung San Suu Kyi Senior Research Fellow in Modern Burmese Studies at the University of Oxford, and did so much work there that is incredible. It's dazzling to see. A political scientist committed to both quantitative and qualitative research, he has spearheaded important social organizations designed to improve lives and help journalist coverage in Myanmar, such as the Myanmar Media and Society Project and of the Burma-Myanmar blog Tea Circle. His research focuses on religion and politics in Southeast Asia, with a special emphasis on Buddhism in Myanmar. His latest book, Buddhism, Politics, and Political Thought in Myanmar, by Cambridge University Press, is a powerful analysis of religion and political conditions in Myanmar. His articles have appeared in Politics and Religion, Journal of Burma Studies, Journal of Contemporary Asia, Journal of Contemporary Buddhism, Buddhism, Law and Society, Asian Survey. I can go on and on about what he's done. Now, Susan and Matthew have collaborated on projects and publications as well as worked independently in ways that have influenced thousands of policymakers and scholars who work on political science, military science, security studies, peace studies, and the study of religion. I am one of those scholars who has been moved by their brilliance, selfless devotion to helping others, and their hard work. And I look forward to learning more from them today. Speaking today on the resilience of religion in contemporary Myanmar, Susan Hayward and Matthew Walton will lecture on Buddhist nationalism and religion in Myanmar and touch upon the greatest calamities we've seen: child soldiers, the Kachin, and the Rohingya. It's thus a great reminder, or a great honor to have such influential scholars here. Please join me in welcoming Susan Hayward and Matthew Walton.
Thank you, Michael. We'd like to start by expressing our thanks today to the organizers of the Shipka lecture. It's a real honor to be here with you today. We want to thank Tom Shipka for establishing the series here. We want to thank Linda Glover, Mark Vopat, and Ellen Tomhave for their support in arranging our talk, as well as the other administrators and facilities and maintenance staff who make it possible for us to gather in this space together. And of course, we want to acknowledge the boundless generosity of our friend Michael Jerryson. Having met him when we're both graduate students, Michael embodied a singular ability to treat us as colleagues and equals while also acting as an invaluable mentor. And I have no doubt that he's similarly influenced so many of you here today, and we want to thank him for his friendship, his compassion, and his intellectual camaraderie.
And all of his laudatory comments that we hope that we can live up to someday. So we want to begin with a story. In April 2008, above the Bay of Bengal, during that tumultuous time of year in Asia when the back of the hot season is broken by the arrival of the rainy season, the conditions were just right to form a powerful storm. As the system grew and slouched northward, it slowly sucked water and wind up into a cyclone. Quickly, its destination became clear: Myanmar's Delta region. This was a vulnerable area that is beset by poverty, lack of development. Despite the advanced warning, Myanmar's isolated military government did little to prepare for the cyclone's arrival, and they even denied the request of international organizations that wanted to arrive to prepare with relief supplies. So when the cyclone hit with water surges up to 40 feet high, there was little reinforcement to protect local communities. Over 100,000 people died. Entire villages were swept away, buildings destroyed. And then the storm receded, and the sun came out to reveal what was left. People will tell you that one of the things that stood out for them when they surveyed the scene in the aftermath of the storm, in some villages, the Buddha and other religious statues were still standing in the midst of the rubble. And there was the relative structural integrity of some of the religious places of worship, pagodas and churches and mosques. Of course, there were very mundane reasons for this, right? There was more material wealth that had been put into the construction of these statues and these buildings. Pagodas were often built on what little existed of higher land in the Delta region, and so they were protected from the surge of waves. The foundations and walls were stronger. The statues were secured tightly to pedestals of cement lotus that were able to withstand the devastating winds. But the fact that these religious statues and buildings endured, that meant something to the people of the Delta region. It reinforced for them something about the spiritual power that was believed to infuse them, the power of the Buddha Dhamma, or of God, stronger than the most ferocious winds, a foundation on which they were able to stand and move forward, quite literally, because those places of worship often became the epicenters for humanitarian response and for rebuilding in the aftermath of the cyclone. Monasteries, Hindu temples, churches, they provided temporary housing for those who had lost their homes. They served as distribution centers for the food and medical supplies, many of which were sent from Yangon via civic associations and religious affiliated organizations, community volunteer groups, many of these which operated on an interreligious basis. Clergy from all the faiths led various rituals related to death for the many lost, while prayer and meditation services provided solace and strength and continue to be used as part of the ongoing psychosocial support to the survivors. Makeshift hospitals were set up on monastery grounds with volunteer doctors from across the country traveling to assist. In these and multiple other ways, religious institutions, actors, networks, rituals, beliefs, and practices stepped up in the absence of adequate international or state humanitarian response to support a community as it sought to rebuild and move forward in the aftermath of crisis.
When it comes to the analysis of religion in Myanmar, there's been a tendency in recent years to focus on religion in all of its constituent parts, actors, ideas, institutions, identities, etc., as a source of rupture, contributing to violence, exclusionary policies, and the fragmentation of communities. Now, there are important insights to be gained from looking at religion's undeniable contribution to conflict drivers, and we've both written about that extensively, and we're happy to discuss it more during the question period. But religious difference does not automatically or inevitably generate conflict. During times of heightened tensions between communities in Myanmar due to rumors or misinformation, pre-existing bonds of trust that cross lines of religious identity, civic organizations, business networks, have enabled the prevention of violence. And as the Nargis anecdote shows, religion has offered critical material and immaterial resources that have helped communities survive and thrive in the midst of crisis. So what we'd like to do today is revisit the history of modern Myanmar from the colonial period to the present and look for how these multidimensional aspects of religion have contributed to individual and community resilience in the face of authoritarianism, insecurity, and violence. We'll focus on three phenomena in particular. First, that religion has provided cohesion, meaning, and purpose in contexts of precarity, meeting what are basic human needs and serving as a source of empowerment. Second, we'll look at religious practices, including meditation, that have been a resource for developing equanimity and spiritual strength. And then third, we'll look at the social services that are provided by religious institutions and actors in the face of state fragility and violence, sometimes across lines of religious difference. And in doing so, we also want to reframe analysis of this phenomenon that's commonly called Buddhist nationalism. While not dismissing the destructive power of anti-Muslim sentiments within this movement, when we see it instead in terms of resilience, it can help us to disaggregate this movement that's characterized in large part by activities meant to strengthen religious practice and shore up communities in the face of uncertainty and anxiety.
So we have to do a little bit of framing before we launch into this. First, what do we mean by resilience? Put simply, resilience refers to adaptability and flexibility. Perhaps it's best known from the realm of psychology, where it came into use in the 1970s to refer to an individual's internal capacity to effectively respond to stress, adversity, and trauma. Psychology has sought to understand both the internal traits, values, and thought patterns that facilitate resilience, such as an optimistic worldview, and external factors, like communities of support. Resilience is understood not to be fixed, but is something that one can strengthen through developing effective coping mechanisms. The field of ecology also adopted the term in the 1970s to describe the ways in which environmental systems respond to natural and man-made disasters. In this sense, ecology looks at how distinct ecosystems respond to shocks by adapting or reorganizing as needed to return to a healthy equilibrium. This analysis has led ecologies to focus on the ways to strengthen the inherent ability of environments to self-repair, rather than solely on ways to mitigate external shocks. In sociology, the term looks at social groups and communities, examining their capacity to maintain their essential functioning and identity in the face of significant stressors or change through adaptation or reorganization. And finally, a socio-ecological definition of resilience draws on the disciplines of both ecology and sociology in pitching resilience as the ability of a particular and complex system to respond to dramatic change in ways that promote human well-being. For the purpose of our analysis here, we're going to draw primarily from that socio-ecological definition, as well as the psychological definition of resilience. Next, a few disclaimers. First, and again, we do not intend to dismiss or explain away how religious ideas and actors have contributed to structural, cultural, and overt forms of violence and social fragmentation in Myanmar, including by legitimating military rule, exclusivist policies, and social prejudices. However, this focus on the negative effects of religion can obscure the fuller picture of how religious ideas, practices, and actors have often simultaneously contributed to the resilience of communities comprising the nation to respond to the challenges and shocks that are brought by colonialism, the creation of the modern state, decades of military predation, and globalization. Beyond the particular circumstances in Myanmar, there are, of course, historical legacies that lead to emphasizing religion's negative contribution to governance and peace, including the long shadow cast by the modern state system's formation in Western Europe and the Enlightenment thinkers who contributed to this process, in part by presenting religion as the feminized, irrational other to the cool, rational, and objective secularity on which the modern political order and human progress were argued to be dependent. However, just as in ecology, scientists look for the natural sources of self-repair found in ecosystems and seek to strengthen those, so too do we believe that there's great value in understanding existing sources of resilience that promote well-being in Myanmar, for which religion has contributed in important ways. In doing this, there's a need for recognizing and holding what scholar Scott Appleby has termed the ambivalence of the sacred, when looking at religion's influence on political, social, and cultural life in any context. Religion is neither being something for which we should be overly critical nor apologist. In any situation and at any time, religious communities are often exhibiting multiple, sometimes contradictory behaviors simultaneously. In this, we also want to avoid essentializing religion or making normative claims about any of the religious traditions we will be investigating. Religion in Myanmar, as anywhere, is lived, internally plural, dynamic, constantly contested. As such, there's no one quintessential Buddhist actor or even Buddhist nationalism. While certain values and practices might be more commonly associated with Buddhism in popular imagination, we need to understand this as an outcome of an ongoing process of social construction. As such, our discussion here is not intended to make claims about what is or is not authentic Buddhism or Christianity. We also do not want to overemphasize the influence of religion as a whole. While we're looking specifically at religion as a dimension of life in Myanmar that shapes political, economic, and social life, we know it is just one dimension among many, and that the trajectory of its influence is not linear. Finally, we will be focusing primarily on Buddhism and to an extent Christianity, given our own background and experience. But there's a great deal more religious diversity in Myanmar. Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Baha'i, and animist, among others. And those communities have no doubt drawn on their own traditions as they've sought to navigate the precarity of their political and social realities in ways that warrant further investigation. We're also happy to talk more about that in the question and answer period.
So a little bit of background here. This country, now known as Myanmar, formerly as Burma, is home to an incredibly diverse set of ethnic and religious communities. While the state recognizes 135 official ethnic groups, that number is disputed and frankly arbitrary and doesn't capture the full picture. The demographic breakdown of ethnic and religious belonging is also highly contested. In addition to the ethnic Burman majority, other major ethnic groups include the Shan, Karen, Rakhine, Mon, Kachin, Chin, and Karenni. Although it's difficult, near impossible, to speak about numbers with certainty, since on the one hand, ethnic data from the 2014 census hasn't actually been released, and if and when it is released, it's likely to be contested and to not capture dynamics such as mixed ethnic heritage. Many of the non-Burman groups, as you can see in this map here, live in outlying states that border neighbors Bangladesh, India, China, and Thailand. They speak their own languages, they have cultural practices that are distinct from the majority Burmans. Theravada Buddhism is the religion of most of the Burman ethnic majority and of many non-Burmans, practiced by about 89% of the overall population, although again, there are reasons for us to be skeptical of reported figures that we're happy to kind of talk about further. Some other ethnic nationality groups, including the Karen, the Kachin, and the Chin, have sizable or even majority Christian populations. The overall majority of Christians in the country is 4%. Muslims comprise about 4% of the population, although that's probably closer to 3% after the violent displacement of Rohingya across the border over the last few years. And the remaining 3% are made up of practitioners of indigenous spirit worship and other religions. So Burma's fall to the British Empire was not a swift one. Beginning in 1824, it took a full 6 decades for the territory that constitutes modern Myanmar to fall, as the British moved slowly from the south northward, toppling kings and claiming territory along the way. Upon capturing the political and religious seat of the Burman monarch in Mandalay, the British established a government that was modeled on their own system, seeking to disentangle the relationship between religion and political power and institutions. For decades, they refused to appoint a Sangha Raja, who was a political and religious head that was meant to oversee the Sangha, the monastic order, and they severed the patronage relationship between the state and the Sangha. So the resulting weakening of Buddhist institutions contributed to an overall discontent that was also fueled by land reforms that shattered traditional tenure, plunged farmers into debt. It enforced vaccinations and a skewing of traditional medical practices, and a range of other British policies and attitudes that dismissed long-standing local practices and culture. And these ruptures led to a series of local rebellions beginning in the 1920s that planted the seeds that would later mature into Burma's independence movement. In the midst of colonialism, religiosity took new forms that were responsive to the particular threats and anxieties felt by communities. Among the Buddhist majority, a revivalist movement arose out of concern about the weakening of the sasana, a term that encompasses the Buddhist religion and the community as a whole. One expression of this was the lay insight meditation movement, for which Burma has become relatively well known today. Its midwife was a monk named Ledi Sayadaw, who began to teach lay Buddhists to both study the Abhidhamma, which is a dense Buddhist philosophical and scholastic treatise, and to practice vipassana, or insight meditation. These were both practices that were traditionally reserved for monks and nuns. Now, Ledi Sayadaw's primary objective in this, what we might call a laicization of monastic practice, was to transfer a set of responsibilities that had previously been on the state to the lay population in order to ensure the propagation and the health of Buddhism. He also argued that Burma had fallen to colonial rule in part due to a regression in people's moral practice. So study and meditation groups around the country were intended to be the moral foundation that would in the future enable political emancipation. The popularity of Ledi Sayadaw's movement reflected and fueled a wider Buddhist revival movement across the country that was itself an expression of indigenous pride in the face of foreign exploitation. And this would gradually coalesce into at least a somewhat shared sense of nationhood among Buddhists. The American Baptist missionary Adoniram Judson, in his journals from the time, noted repeatedly how the colonial experience seemed to spur an increase in religiosity that strengthened social cohesion, especially among the majority community.
While there is evidence that Christians arrived in Burma as early as the 13th century, it was not until the colonial period that Burmese began to convert in significant numbers to the religion. Notably, missionaries like Judson had little success in their efforts to proselytize among the majority Burman Buddhist population. It was among other ethnic nationality groups that he found reception, an experience that was shared by Catholic missionaries who first focused their efforts in Karen State. The experience of violent conflict between Burman and other ethnic nationality groups, which was only exacerbated by British divide and rule tactics, contributed to the spread of Christianity within these groups. Burmese Catholic priest and scholar Father Edward P. Evans reports that as former royal soldiers engaged in banditry across the countryside in Karen State following British annexation, Catholic priests formed self-protection groups. So seeing these priests as a source of protection in a vulnerable situation, many Karen converted to the faith. In Chin State, it was those fleeing violence in the hill country who often converted. As argued by Chin scholar Lian Sakong, in the midst of utter disruption brought by the arrival of the British to a region that had previously been isolated, local Chin found in Christianity a useful new system for meaning and symbols that could unite disparate tribes, bringing a sense of security and greater group cohesion. A similar phenomenon reflects the experience of the Kachin. And so whether providing a set of moral discourses and practices that could critique colonial rule, or contributing to group cohesion in the midst of social, economic, and political upheaval, religious beliefs, identities, and associations gave communities living in the midst of colonialism a means to cope and respond when faced with the disruption and uncertainty brought by it. The post-independence period in the 1950s almost immediately saw renewed waves of violence break out across the country as insurgent movements representing diverse ethnic, religious, and ideological communities fought for independence from a state that was increasingly perceived to serve the interests of the majority Burman Buddhist community. The waves of violence led eventually to the 1962 military coup that installed a military regime that would rule until 2011. Under the authoritarian rule of successive military-led governments, those of all ethnicities and religions found themselves in a situation of precarity, without dependable rule of law, the protection of individual rights, nor often adequate basic social services to meet their needs. At the same time, violent conflict continued across the country, and ordinary people often found themselves caught between military, paramilitary, and ethnic armed groups. Meanwhile, they are cut off from the international community due to sanctions, and so the people of Myanmar developed sophisticated and creative means to endure protracted violence and authoritarianism, and religious resources played key roles in this. As during the late colonial period, the spread of Christianity among Karen, Chen, and Kachin was accelerated by experiences of violent conflict, finding particularly fertile ground to take root in precisely those places and moments of acute political violence and marginality. It's critical, of course, to note that the adoption of Christianity was driven by, and in turn drove, forms of ethnic nationalism and political resistance against a majority community and state that would fuel violent insurgencies. In this process, religious identity divides sharpened and were politically charged, while certain ideas, including those of just war or holy war, legitimated those forms of violence. But another dimension of this same story is the way in which Christian identity and practice was embraced as a response to experiences of violence by a community displaced and fragmented, many of whom were not themselves participating in violent movements, but rather seeking and finding security, meaning, and belonging. Meanwhile, Christian organizations provided schooling and other resources in areas that have been historically ignored by the state. Following the coup in 1962, General Ne Win expelled all foreign missionaries from the country and nationalized some of the formal Christian-based schools, hospitals, and other institutions. But the targeting of formal Christian institutional organizations and actors by the military, who saw them as foreign influence and a threat to their rule, it complicated, but it did not prevent Christian institutions and organizations that were now indigenized from providing critical services to these communities living in the margins. From setting up camps to those displaced by violence, to establishing and running orphanages, Churches and their leaders continue to provide material support to vulnerable communities, while the social bonding and shared ritual aspects of communal religious life brought immaterial good, like predictable routines, spiritual outlets to express suffering and hope, and relational bonds of care across communities.
Turning back to the Buddhist community, when faced with military repression, some Buddhist democratic activists, especially those who were facing imprisonment or house arrest, turned to this kind of meditation and Buddhist study that Ledi Sayadaw had first taught. The anthropologist Gustav Hauptmann conducted research in the 1990s that suggested that this insight meditation functioned as a psychological coping mechanism for imprisoned democratic activists. Their accounts revealed how insight meditation allowed them to focus their efforts, realizing that not only were the conditions of their imprisonment inherently impermanent, according to the Buddha's teachings, but that their physical confinement didn't limit their ability to try to reach a more ultimate stage of liberation, enlightenment. Now, insight meditation as a practice was probably limited to a more select group of elites, but many former political prisoners that I've interviewed have discussed the ways in which they use Buddhist teachings more generally to better understand and cope with their imprisonment. So students who were jailed after the 1988 protests often found themselves imprisoned alongside disrobed Buddhist monks who would share Dhamma wisdom related to conditions of suffering. Others found that the Buddha's teaching of metta, a feeling of non-discriminating loving kindness, was invaluable in helping them to manage relationships with abusive soldiers and prison guards, and also to ease feelings of hatred and bitterness after their release. The anthropologist Ingrid Hjort has studied contemporary lay meditation communities, arguing that through their practice and their spiritual meditational attainments, they've been able to claim a sort of moral high ground, right? Occupying this space from which monks would have historically sought to restrain political authorities. And it's allowed them to express a kind of moral skepticism of the often brutal politics of previous military governments. So this didn't find expression as an overt oppositional movement, but it was a way of reasserting particular Buddhist grounds for political legitimacy and of the role of meditation communities in cultivating moral judgment of public decisions and policies. Also, the collective nature of meditative practice within this movement, in contrast to the image of the solitary meditator, was a way of strengthening feelings of community and social belonging. Contemporary community aid and development work in Myanmar is often framed through the lens of parahita, a Pali-derived Burmese word that refers broadly to work done for the benefit of others. In some of my research, I've noted the ways in which Buddhist donation practices have shifted since the middle of the 20th century, particularly in the last few decades, to include more social assistance activities, such as donations to orphanages or hospitals or otherwise marginalized communities. This marks a really important change from the more common norm of Buddhist donation to respected monks or solely to religious institutions. Part of the transformation has come through the advocacy of prominent monks who've encouraged their supporters to make these types of social donations and also have framed them in terms of Buddhist discourses of merit. But it also reflects a resurgence and expanded institutionalization of localized self-help and community support practices that have existed in Burmese communities for generations, but have taken on a more central and critical role in Myanmar under military rule. The political science Gerard McCarthy has analyzed the ways in which these groups and practices rose to greater prominence, partly in response to the Burmese state's abdication of obligation to provide social services to its citizens, especially as the economy plummeted from the 1990s. And so the result has been this quite odd mixture of neoliberal social assistance networks supported by prominent business people, but framed through Buddhist ideas of mutual aid and merit. So almost 6 years ago, Susan and I published a paper in the East-West Center's Policy Studies series that addressed some of these new Buddhist movements and anti-Muslim violence. And it's sobering and depressing to reflect on the fact that all of the worrying factors we identified then have either persisted or intensified, despite what I think we can see as the superficial entrenchment of electoral democracy through a change in government after 2016. So political reform has been stalled for at least the past few years, and very few opportunities for citizen participation beyond political elites. There's a formal ceasefire process that hasn't progressed since 2015. In fact, new armed groups have risen to prominence since then, and active fighting continues in parts of the country. Activists, critics of the government and military, and other marginalized populations continue to be harassed, repressed, and prosecuted, often with antiquated colonial laws that are applied punitively and hypocritically. Not only have economic development and foreign investment stalled, the investment that has been present since 2011 has been driven in support of an exploitative and unsustainable model of growth that's exacerbated land grabs and indebtedness for much of the country's rural population. Perhaps the most globally recognized phenomenon to emerge from this moment of precarity that you might be familiar with has been the rise in mass Buddhist activism, often indiscriminately labeled Buddhist nationalism, which is a label we want to kind of contest and nuance a bit today. This activism, we argue, is motivated by a widely shared anxiety in Myanmar today regarding the perpetuation of Buddhism. This isn't a new concern, but it's been exacerbated by rapid change and reshaped through its engagement with globalized narratives and dynamics. The most visible and influential group operating in Myanmar's religio-political space is Mabatha, the Organization for the Protection of Race and Religion. Founded in 2013 by influential monks and their lay supporters, this group represented a more institutionalized response to the decentralized activism of its predecessor, the 969 movement, whose boycotts of Muslim-owned businesses and links to incidents of anti-Muslim violence worried senior monks about the risk of damaging the image of Buddhism. So within the space of a few years, Mabatha rose rapidly to prominence under an enabling environment created by the former government. They influenced the passage of 4 discriminatory laws for the protection of race and religion, and only in the last few years has the group gradually receded from national prominence and influence, partly due to pressure and criticism from the current government, and then partly due to a series of disciplinary actions from monastic authorities. Now, while most analysis of Mabatha has focused on its anti-Muslim orientation and the virulent offensive speech of some of its most visible advocates, things that we've written about extensively, here we want to reframe the group and its activities in the terms of today's talk. That is, when we understand Mabatha as a religiously driven response to destabilizing societal changes, it brings to the fore the range of grassroots activities that have actually made up most of the group's work. Without ignoring or excusing the dangerous anti-Muslim orientation of some of the group's members, this lens of analysis positions Mabatha as part of a broader movement to shore up resilience in the face of uncertainty and perceived threats to religion. And crucially, we think that this lens helps to illuminate 2 other overlooked aspects of this movement. First, it better explains the widespread appeal of Mabatha's activities, especially and including among people who reject its anti-Muslim stance. And then second, it disaggregates a movement that's usually painted in these inaccurate broad brushstrokes and allows us to distinguish between those activities designed to strengthen religious resilience and then those designed to stoke hatred, divide communities, and attack vulnerable populations, and to see how these 2 often coexist in an illustration of Appleby's ambivalence of the sacred. So while anti-Muslim rhetoric and actions have been at the front of almost all of the coverage of Mabatha, this group built up its base of support through organizing, supporting, and allying with other groups in providing a range of community-oriented activities. A few examples. Since 2014, Myanmar has seen an explosion of Dhamma schools, these classes that are organized outside of the formal education system that teach children Buddhist history, values, and practices. The image up here is a curriculum book from one of the other groups working in this space, the Dhamma School Foundation. And Mabatha has championed this movement, seeing it as an essential activity for the transmission of Buddhism to a younger generation that many Burmese Buddhists see as already ensnared by pop culture and social media. The anthropologists Malin McKay and Kinchit Win have shown the range of activities that Mabatha facilitates, including legal clinics, microfinance networks, and support groups that empower women's participation. Many of the women they spoke with rejected some of the group's strongest anti-Muslim messages, but appreciated the opportunity that Mabatha gave them to play leadership roles in a religious association, something that really wasn't available to them in Buddhist institutions. And Mabatha monks have also been at the forefront of this paradigm shift that I mentioned earlier. This photo here on the right is from the cover of one of Mabatha's nationalist journals, and it shows prominent monks giving donations to needy lay people. This is a complete reversal of the common hierarchy and logic of Buddhist giving. Now, in many cases, a lot of these activities aren't explicitly Mabatha activities, but instead they're organized locally, often building on networks that predated Mabatha as an organization. But they feed back into this broader branding and agenda of protecting and propagating Buddhism. And we insist that we can't ignore the fact that not only are many of these activities welcome in the eyes of Myanmar Buddhists, but they're the kinds of things that any social service-oriented group would be lauded for doing. And moreover, they're often motivated not by a sense of Islam as a threat, but as a way of responding to a range of what we might call the incursions of modernity that generate concern among Buddhists for the persistence of their religion's practices and moral values. As you're no doubt aware, some of the most ferocious forms of violence in recent years in Myanmar have taken place in Rakhine State, where in 2016 and again in 2017, hundreds of thousands of people, primarily Rohingya Muslims, were displaced by massive military operations that claimed to target an insurgency group that called itself the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. The military's actions in these cases are now being investigated as acts of genocide by the International Court of Justice, but Rakhine State is also beset by other forms of violence. Over the past year, fighting between the Arakan Army, a group that claims to represent the state's ethno-religious majority, and then the Burmese military has led to further displacement of local communities. In 2018, the U.S. Institute of Peace supported research to understand how the religious landscape of Rakhine State was being impacted by and in turn impacting conflict and peace dynamics. Among the findings were clear indications of how local level community networks, often religiously inspired and organized, were continuing to operate in the midst of conflict to address community needs, including distributing humanitarian relief, caring for the displaced, and serving educational and health needs of their communities. So political violence still continued to strain intercommunal relations, and some Buddhist leaders discouraged cross-communal service. But in some cases, this work even extended across ethnic and religious lines in a way that illustrate how these religious service networks are contributing to community resilience, both within and between groups.
So when we revisit Myanmar's history to examine religion's contribution to resilience in the face of precarity, again, several themes emerge. One, in the face of insecurity and uncertainty, religion has provided cohesion, meaning, and purpose for both Buddhists and Christians in ways that are meeting basic human needs and serving as a source of empowerment in communities who can otherwise be feeling disempowered in a context of threatening political, social, and economic forces, those from both within the state and from outside. Two, religious practices, including insight meditation, have been embraced by individuals and communities who cite it as a resource for developing equanimity and internal emotional, psychological, and spiritual strength to handle the challenges they confront in the face of authoritarianism and violence. And three, religious institutions, both formal and informal organizations and networks and practices of charity, have provided services to community members in the face of state failure. From schools to healthcare to humanitarian relief, often offered across religious lines of difference, these material provisions have ensured the very survival of communities in the midst of ongoing shocks, while offering purposeful action for those involved. A study released by Harvard University last year offered empirical data to demonstrate how violent conflict is correlated with and may in fact drive increased religiosity. The data collected by the authors showed that for both Christians and Muslims in Sierra Leone, Uganda, and Tajikistan, the greater and more direct their exposure to violent conflict, the more likely they were to participate in religious life in a manner that was often sustained long after the end of violent conflict. Drawing from cultural evolutionary theory, the authors hypothesized two reasons for this. First, that at times of uncertainty and insecurity, communities tend to assert and police social norms more strongly. And of course, religious ideas, rituals, associations, and practices contribute easily and powerfully to this normative work. Second, religious rituals, ideas, and community belonging have been shown to provide psychological support to those facing existential threat, protracted stress, and trauma. So we believe the Myanmar case bears this out But to this, we would also posit that another cause for the ways in which religious institutions provide basic social services to communities when a state is involved in violent conflict or the international community. Another cause for this increase in religiosity is the ways in which religious institutions are also providing basic social services in the face of a state's unwillingness or inability to provide those services in the midst of violent conflict. In the vacuum of state legitimacy or capacity, religious institutions often step up, mobilizing their networks and resources to serve community needs. At least in the case of Myanmar, this clearly seems to drive some of the forms of religious participation and religiosity more broadly. So religion is providing these material, social, and psychological forms of support for those living in the midst of precarity and existential threat that leads to increased forms of religiosity. But what the effect of that increase in religiosity has on societal relations and norms, political governance, and individual attitudes and behaviors is, of course, not predetermined. Religious participation can fuel fragmentation and violence when the ideas and practices advanced through participation drive normative attitudes and behaviors that strengthen the cohesion of one community at the expense of another or in opposition to another. Or religious participation can strengthen intercommunal bonds when the ideas and practices reinforced through that participation drive norms of trust and collaboration. In Myanmar, we can see how new and increased forms of religiosity in response to colonialism, authoritarianism, and violence have exhibited some of these both negative and positive effects on broader society. Besides considering the ways in which religiosity can be oriented towards fragmentation and violence, or community and peace, we might also reflect on the particular circumstances under which religious practice contributes to resilience. Psychological studies in zones of active conflict have documented the short, medium, and long-term impacts faced by those who have experienced traumatic episodes directly and indirectly related to violence. Some recent studies have shown how elements of religious life, including contemplative practices like prayer, meditation, and ritual practice, can address people's therapeutic needs in these circumstances. Meditation, for example, appears to address the very same parts of the brain that are negatively impacted by trauma, and studies are indicating that they might help undo some of the damage that is wrought by PTSD, so reducing emotional and mental distress. But it's unlikely that personal meditation and prayer alone is enough, as your own Dr. Michael Jerrison has surveyed in some of his studies in his work, and in examining how Buddhist and Muslim communities in southern Thailand draw on religion as a source of coping in the midst of violent conflict. He has shown how the communal nature of religious practice and its routinization appears critical for deriving the most benefit for individuals. Applied to Myanmar, one notes how the mass lay meditation movement, the high levels of religious charity efforts, and the routinized practices of religious life are practiced across communities in ways that have beneficial effect. What we offer is a hypothesis that is based on anecdote and observation, but the situation is ripe for further empirical research to investigate more directly how these forms of routinized religious practice have in fact contributed to individual resilience. The question becomes, how will the Burmese people, recognizing and building on the rich resources their religious traditions and practices have offered to resilience, continue to do so in a manner that mitigates some of the destructive effects of certain religious ideas and movements? We've seen powerful examples of this throughout history, from the Nargis example to last year's White Rose interfaith campaign that brought together diverse community members to extend protection and support to Muslims, or the mobilization of relief efforts for the vulnerable, including in the aftermath of anti-Muslim violence. The ritual practice that is part and parcel of many Burmese citizens' daily lives can continue to play a role in providing emotional, psychological, and spiritual support to individuals, particularly when it is routinized and socialized. And there's a largely untapped, but we think significant potential for these rituals and practices to be employed, particularly to the critical work of inter-ethnic reconciliation. That that potential really comes into focus for us when we shift our lens to both see the resilience of religion as a dimension of Myanmar societal life and its contribution to the resilience of individuals and communities throughout Myanmar's modern history. So thank you for letting us take you on this journey through modern Myanmar's experiences with religion and resilience, and we look forward to being in discussion with all of you now.